Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. Now, with no further ado, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Tonight we're going to start on Iran, because Iran seems to be at the center of a lot of what's going on at the moment. Flurry of diplomatic activity in Israel and elsewhere. What's going on in Lebanon, what's going on with Hamas, what's going elsewhere in the region. So let's dive straight into it. First of all, we spoke last week about how we would see the new president of Iran's policies based on what sort of people he appoints to the cabinet. And we said it could go either way. If you'll go for the previous, some of the members of the previous cabinet, especially those who were involved in the JCPOA Iran nuclear talks, which was considered more moderate, or whether he would pick up some of the leftovers from the Ahmadinejad regime, which is, as we know, populated by ultra radicals. And it certainly seems as if he's moved towards the latter. There seems to be some very problematic elements, some real ultra radicals, some leftovers from the Ahmadinejad regime, an interior minister that is wanted for his role in the bombing of the Jewish center in Argentina many years ago. And again, if we just look at some of the appointments so far, I don't think we have a full cabinet yet, and obviously it has to go through the parliament, and obviously the supreme leader has to sign off on it. But it definitely doesn't bode well for the West, for the US, for return to the JCPOA. The sounds that we've had coming out of Iran ever since the ascendancy of the new president has not been particularly positive for engagement and some sort of return to positive talks in Vienna. And I think the appointments would also send another signal that this is a government that will be extremely hard to tolerate it in the West. There are so far, any faces that can sort of, be shown to the West as someone that they can deal with. We haven't seen any of that so far. And it doesn't seem that that's the direction that they're going in. As we know, one of Iran's tentacles in the region, probably its strongest, arguably with the Houthis in Yemen, is Hezbollah in Lebanon. We talked last week a little bit how Lebanon is in real trouble, economic, socially, politically, diplomatically. Apparently electricity is down to an hour or two a day throughout the country, massive inflation. There's been even remarkably or not completely unprecedented, but the leading Christian Maronite leader in Lebanon came out openly against Hezbollah, and already predictably he has faced death threats. But what we saw earlier in the week is in response to a barrage of rockets ostensibly sent over by Palestinian groups. Again, as I mentioned last week, while it may have been Palestinian armed groups, it was from an area very heavily controlled by Hezbollah, so it's doubtful whether these groups would take any action, especially as vociferous as this, shooting over the border into Israel, into northern Israel, without the okay and the say-so from Hezbollah. As we talked about last week, maybe that was Hezbollah's way of sending a message without blatantly and openly doing that. Israel's response was relatively robust. First time that it had launched so many attacks into Lebanon, probably since the war in 2006. And then we had, mostly targeted some of the rocket sites and open areas, and Hezbollah likewise targeted Israel and made a big statement about also targeting open areas. They said that our response, this is what Hezbollah said, our response will be proportionate to the Israelis. And Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of the Hezbollah terrorist organization, gave a speech that was actually planned a while in advance to commemorate from their point of view, the Second Lebanon War, again, these sort of occasions are always used for saber rattling, to try and show off to the Lebanese people how they are protecting them, but also interestingly spoke about the response and said that, we're not looking for war. We're looking for just a proportionate response, but we're not looking for escalation, but we are ready for one. Those words were almost echoed completely by the Israeli Northern Command, the IDF, Northern Command, I should say, that basically said also, we're not interested in a war, we're not interested in escalation, but we're ready we're ready for one. What is interesting is that quite a few players in the region have alluded to Prime Minister Naftali Bennett's words that he made a few weeks ago relating to Hamas, where he said, our enemies should know that the rules of the game have changed. And we actually did see in Gaza, when we started to see these explosive balloons coming over the border again and setting fire to quite a lot of hectarage or dunams of Israeli fields in the south, we actually saw a far greater response than we've seen in many years to these attacks. And that seemed to quieten things down. What Israel has been doing ever since is trying to sort of do this carrot and stick. It's trying to show that if there will be any attacks, then it will certainly use the stick, either in a disproportionate response, if you will, and taking certain measures, not letting in trucks of certain materials, and limiting the area that Palestinian Gazan fishermen can fish in those waters. That's a tactic which successive Israeli governments have used for a while. Sometimes it's up to as much as 18 kilometers from the coast. Sometimes it's down to as few as 6. And again, that's being used as the sort of carrot and stick. Also in the region today, two very interesting guests. Israel had was the CIA, the head of the CIA, William Burns, who came to the region. Again, he's one of those officials, and I'll talk about the other one again. For Israel, it's all about Iran. For some of the other officials who are coming to visit Israel, they also want to talk about Palestinians. And interestingly, he went over to Ramallah to meet with Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas after. I would argue, not necessarily coincidentally, at around the same time, Israel announced two very interesting developments. One is that quite unprecedentedly, Israel is going to agree to build 1,000 units for the Palestinians, or allow the Palestinian Authority to build 1,000 units in Area C. Now, Area C is one of the 3 areas that were created in the Oslo Accords. There was Area A, which is under full Palestinian control, which is where 95% or something like that of the Palestinians live. They have full control over their own lives. It's run by the Palestinian Authority courts, taxation, etc., etc. Area B is mixed, where you'll find mostly, well, solely Palestinians, and it's under, again, Palestinian civil rule, but it's under Israeli military control. In other words, that Israel has, the IDF has a free hand in these areas. Usually they are close to Israeli settlements, Israeli communities over the Green Line. And then there's Area C, which is the majority of the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And it's where all of the Israeli communities, the so-called settlements, are. There are a few Palestinians who live there, but over the years, it's been very difficult for them to be able to build. Much of what they are doing is illegal, sometimes even buttressed and supported by actors such as the EU, which again is in contravention of the Oslo Accords, which they themselves witnessed and were party to in subsequent agreements. So for the first time in memory, I think maybe ever, Israel has agreed to build Palestinian units. It's probably, as I said, not completely coincidentally, when William Burns has come, a very high-level official in the Biden administration, probably wanted to try and bolster the Palestinian Authority, and the fact that he went and he was greeted by the Palestinians. You saw a very positive atmosphere, far different from the atmosphere under the Trump administration. As I said, probably not coincidentally, and probably as a trade-off at the same time, the Israeli government released the fact that they're going to be also building 2,000 new units in the Israeli communities, the so-called settlements, at the same time. So that was probably a trade-off that William Burns brought with him, probably to try and appease the Palestinians. Prime Minister Naftali Bennett gets something of what he wants, something perhaps he doesn't want, but also within the government, it will become a lot more palatable because don't forget they have far left parties and even a narrow party. So for them to release the details that they're going to be allowing 2,000 new units built in the settlements, the fact that it was offset with by 1,000 Palestinian units probably quietened any voices that otherwise would have perhaps made trouble. Another interesting visitor the last few days was the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the Foreign Ministry of Bahrain. It was actually quite a successful trip, an interesting trip. I signed a lot of MOUs with different think tanks. Interestingly, went for a deep sea dive. Apparently, he's a big fan of deep sea diving by Rosh Nikra, which is the furthest north in Israel you can go, which in some anti-Israel elements around the, let's say, Muslim world was obviously castigated. But interestingly enough, he made very positive comments that for him, the JCPOA is also a big problem. It's acted against peace and security in the region, and it's something which they are unhappy about. He then modified those words later in an interview with the Jerusalem Post, said that they're not looking to not necessarily go back to JCPOA, but they want it to be longer and stronger. These are some of the words that have been used by certain diplomats around the region because of the worry that Iran is going to use the JCPOA or the stalling towards an agreement to try and enrich more and more uranium, get more and more knowledge towards nuclear weapons capability, et cetera, et cetera. But he also had to put in a comment that for him, the Palestinian issue is still at the forefront. Interestingly, also on the same day, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid was greeted in Rabat in Morocco, the first foreign minister and senior Israeli minister for, I believe, 20 years to arrive in Morocco. He's going to be opening not necessarily an embassy at this point, it seems, but the fact is, from those who I spoke to who on that trip, whether they're journalists or part of Lapid's party, they seem to be extremely warmly received. There were worries that Morocco wouldn't necessarily go the same way as UAE and Bahrain. It would be more of a sort of top-down, it would be a warmth at the highest levels, not necessarily from others. But so far, the trip has gone pretty well. In domestic politics, moving on quickly in the last few minutes before I move over to question and answers, the Knesset is now on vacation. So there's obviously, the tone has been lowered over the last few days. But in Israel, the biggest talk of the news is the coronavirus and whether the government is doing enough to lower the figures. Israel is the first country in the world, and I believe one of the only two have already administered a third dose of the vaccine to those over 60 years old or 65, in the hope that they can stop what is increasingly raising numbers every single day. I think we got up to 6,000 a couple of days ago. And there is a worry that we could go into another lockdown. And as you can imagine, people like former Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, leader of the opposition, has tried to make quite a lot of hay out of this, said, I left Naftali Bennett in almost 0 cases a day, and the country was open. And now within a few weeks, they've gone to the verge of another lockdown. Obviously, that's unfair because the Delta virus, first of all, had already been in the country during the Netanyahu administration. And as we can see in the US and other places, the Delta variant has nothing to do with politics, and it's spreading in many places around the world. So in Israel, it's no different. And certainly the numbers are going up. People are very worried about this. Israel is trying to, this is the message that has been sent by this government, trying to do everything to ensure that there will be no more lockdowns. Finance Minister Victor Lieberman came out and said that lockdowns don't necessarily lower the number of people infected, but we do know that it hurts the economy. So there's a lot of individuals in that government who are certainly anti-lockdown, and they're trying everything to prevent that. So they're taking pretty much today and tomorrow the last possible measures to try and prevent a lockdown, which either will be at the end of August, remembering that September 1st is the beginning of the school year, and throughout September are the Jewish holidays of New Year, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Some are saying that that should be when there's a lockdown, if there's going to be one, because there's only 6 or 7 working days throughout the whole month. But obviously, as you can imagine, some of the religious elements, especially the ultra-Orthodox, are basically saying, they shouldn't harm our festivals, and considering everything else that's going on and considering what's going on in the last year, this is the last time that you should choose. You should try and do it now or later, but not harm the Jewish festivals. So there's quite a lot to think about on that particular level, because that seems to be where most of the attention in Israel is going at this point. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions on this or other subjects.
All right, thank you so much. The first question we have in is from Carrie. To what extent do the events in Lebanon have an effect on the Israeli internal affairs?
Well, it certainly at the highest levels, everyone's watching what's going on in Lebanon, as many other countries around the world. Defense Minister Benny Gantz came out and said some very interesting comments, saying, don't use us as an excuse, which is something we've talked about before, which is fairly obvious that Hezbollah are trying to distract and deflect from internal problems in Lebanon to try and attack Israel and try to deflect and distract the Lebanese population and trying to gain in popularity. As we spoke about last week, they're certainly suffering on that particular level in Lebanon at the moment. And Benny Gantz also said that, he seeks an international assistance plan for Lebanon. A lot of other countries obviously have talked about that. But what he said was interesting is that Israel would be happy to be involved in any way and give any sort of assistance. Now, we know that's extremely, extremely unlikely, but sometimes these things still need to be said. Today, there were meetings with UNIFIL, which is the UN-mandated mission that's supposed to watch over the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701, which is supposed to demilitarize the whole of southern Lebanon, I think below the Litani River, if I'm not much mistaken. And it's clear that that's the furthest thing that's actually happening. But this was supposed to be a routine meeting between Israeli army officials and UNIFIL. But again, as we've seen ever since the Second Lebanon War, UNIFIL pretty much doesn't really do anything in a robust manner. Sometimes it does give information about what they see, but not too much else. But again, another sign that Israel wants to send to the international community that it doesn't seek an escalation. And the fact is that Hezbollah are still very much have a very strong military presence, and probably gave them a warning that we'll not sit on our hands next time this happens.
Thank you. So you just mentioned that Hezbollah has a very strong military presence. Carrie Hildebrand asks, with the accelerating meltdown of Lebanon, is there any evidence of cracks developing within Hezbollah?
Within Hezbollah, there doesn't seem to be, but definitely they are losing support. As I said, the fact that the leader of the Christian community, I believe it's the Archbishop, who came out openly against Hezbollah, shows a certain amount of their popularity is waning. I mean, obviously, many Christians are not the biggest fan of Hezbollah, but the fact that he could openly come out and make these comments, even though then he received death threats, shows the waning popularity of Hezbollah, maybe a lack of control from Hezbollah. A lot of people blame them for the explosion in the port of Beirut last year, for some of the, I wouldn't say civil war, but certainly some of the factions that have been fighting within Lebanon. And the fact is, I think we mentioned it last time, that some Hezbollah operatives who were shooting from near a Druze village were attacked and arrested and then handed over to the Lebanese army. There's been a backlash on the Druze community from within Shiite strongholds as a result of that. But it's clear that Hezbollah do not have that aura of invincibility that maybe they once had. And a lot of people in Lebanon are pointing fingers at Hezbollah as at least a major part of the problems that the country is facing currently.
Thank you. From an anonymous viewers. Based on the makeup of the new governing coalition, some observers expected the new Israeli government to be more dovish vis-a-vis Iran. However, recent comments by various members of the government have sounded quite hawkish. Is the new government, in your view, more willing to act aggressively against Iran compared to the prior government, or less?
I should say on the Iranian issue, it's not as split as the Palestinian issue. You have everyone from the let's say, mainstream left all the way to the far right, who believes in a robust response. The words that come out of Yair Lapid's mouth, Naftali Bennett's mouth, even some more left-wing elements, is not that different from what Benjamin Netanyahu, when he was prime minister, would have said. There is a relative consensus, I would say relative, because obviously it's not unanimous, that Israel, has to be able to take action against Iran if it believes that it is getting closer and closer to nuclear weapons capability. Even you had Minister of Regional Cooperation, Isaiah Frej, who is of the Meretz Party, the first Arab minister in a while, I believe, who has been speaking a lot to his partners in the region, whether it's UAE, Bahrain, and he even admitted Saudi Arabia. We're working very closely with them on the Iranian issue. So when you have a member of Meretz, an Arab minister of Meretz, talking about Iran, shows that even on those elements, it's a major problem. So as Naftali Bennett said on many of these issues, we're certainly not going to be any more left-wing than the previous administration. And so far in Iran, it's been pretty robust talk. And no little action, I'm sure, behind the scenes.
Thank you. And Isaac Cohen asked, President Biden has been pretty appeasing Iran by eliminating a series of sanctions. But now with the new president, will Biden be the American Chamberlain? He states that the breakout is about 9 weeks away for assembling the nuclear bomb. Will Israel and Biden's, sorry, I'm trying to paraphrase, and Biden has been pressuring Israel not to attack. Will Israel do it alone? Does it have the military capability to withstand thousands of rocket attacks from Hezbollah in the north, Hamas in the south, and Iran precisely targeted rockets?
First of all, I think we should be clear. Iran is not weeks away from a nuclear bomb. Iran is perhaps, and I think I mentioned last week, Benny Gantz, defense minister, talked about 10 weeks from having weapons grade nuclear material. That's still a certain amount of way from actually having a nuclear bomb, because then you have to have the technology for payload and for missile and all the rest. Again, it's not to belittle and not to make light of the situation. They are moving very, very quickly towards, on multiple fronts, towards nuclear weapons capability, but they're not 9 weeks away from a bomb. What we are hearing from the Americans is they want to relieve some of the sanctions for a complete cessation of the enrichment level. Iran is standing firm so far. It says that we will not even talk about stopping or ceasing enrichment levels or returning to the JCPOA until there is a complete lifting of sanctions. That is the message that's come out of Tehran. And I'm sure the new president will certainly be no more dovish on this than his predecessors. So we're going to have to wait and see. It does seem that the Americans want to return to the JCPOA. The jury is certainly out on whether the Iranians are even going to return to Vienna at the moment. There seems to be a bit of a lull. Perhaps a lot are, as I said, waiting to see what happens with this new Iranian government. Who are the major players? Who is going to be the face of the talks? Who's going to be the face for the West? But so far, I think most people who look at Iran would just be pessimistic about this.
Thank you for clarifying that. Aviva Klein-Frank asked, do you think the Arab Party and the coalition will bind Israel's hands to react militarily in Lebanon?
Well, so far it hasn't. Israel, as I said, did react stronger than it has for 15 years since the Second Lebanon War. Don't forget, the Arab Party, as we've spoken about before, it's a small party. It's certainly in a 61-seat government is absolutely essential, but there's an understanding that Hezbollah is a problematic player. Don't forget there's other elements of the Sunni Shiite rivalry. There's a lot of Arab towns in the north that could come under attack from Hezbollah. So I don't see it necessarily as binding the hands because any more, again, than the previous government, because the previous government didn't take such robust action when it had a so-called right-wing government. But as I said, I think at the end of the day, I go back to my earlier comments where neither side really seeks an escalation. It could be that one side will make an error calculation. Someone will die on either side, and that will certainly could lead to an escalation. There's certainly tension there, but it's clear that neither side wants an escalation at this point, and I don't think that's necessarily down to the fact that there's an Arab party in the coalition.
Thank you. Mir Herzl Melmed asks, is there any sign that the American abandonment of Afghanistan is bringing some Arab countries closer to Israel, as it seems America is an unreliable ally?
There's always a certain amount of, people watching all around the world certainly look at what America's doing in one arena, especially the sort of, let's say, joint enemies of the US, Israel, and the wider West, to see what they think of as weakness, what they think of as strength. It's too early to say at this point, but certainly, a Taliban takeover of Afghanistan, last time they took over, we saw it as a base for Al-Qaeda, which is it's still around, but obviously not as powerful as it was when it was given free rein in Afghanistan. That it could certainly be a problematic base of operations for certain rogue and terrorist regimes, which, while Israel is not necessarily the first enemy of many of these groups, it's certainly on the list. So remains to be seen. American weakness, or perceived American weakness, is never necessarily good for Israel. But we are dealing in a different era. We do see more and more Arab countries, Sunni pragmatic countries, who are coming towards Israel because of their joint enemies. So we are living in a different reality to when the Taliban last ruled Afghanistan.
So along those lines, this might be reaching out of the wheelhouse here. Robert Larrick asks, do you think Russia should really want an empowered Islamic terrorist state? Iran and perhaps the Taliban in Afghanistan, with nuclear umbrella, with control of the Mediterranean in its underbelly to radicalize more states and people?
Oh, good question. I do have some friends who actually would be expertise in this area, but I'm going to leave that for some of those. There are some excellent papers that are coming out on this subject, but that's outside of my area of expertise. So I'm going to leave that one for others to answer.
All right, wonderful. And in our last few minutes here, Carrie Hildebrand asks, upwards of 1 million eligible Israeli citizens remain unvaccinated. Why isn't the government more proactive in promoting or pressuring them to be vaccinated? In the United States here, we have the same problem.
Right. So the fact that after, 8-9 months of the vaccination program, the fact that there are still 1 million holdouts and eligible Israelis, they've tried everything from the carrot, the stick, incentives. They're talking about allowing them to enter into a lottery where they could win a lot of money. The fact is now they're lowering the ability of the unvaccinated to go to any public events, whether it's the cinema, whether it's the swimming pool, whether it's the gym, whether it's concerts or whatever it may be, sporting events. They're really trying to push as many as possible. There is a disproportionate amount in the Arab community. So there is some effort to try and convince in the Arab community, and to a lesser extent in the ultra-Orthodox community, to vaccinate. But when you have people who are ideologically against it, again, not all of those 1 million will be ideologically against it. There's a certain amount of 12 to 16-year-olds who we've talked about in the past. They believe that they're, like all kids around the world, believe that they're invincible. Why do they need this? They can't be bothered, or whatever it is. So they don't do it. But there has been many efforts. They put a lot of money in to try and convince this million to get vaccinated. But we see drips and drabs every day, a few thousand here and there. That could also be people who are turning 12 as well, or other reasons. But short of forcing in order to get a vaccine, there's nothing really you can do, either here, the US, or elsewhere. Everyone is dealing with the same issue. How do you convince, cajole, incentivize, whatever it may be, those who remain unvaccinated to get the shot? Israel is struggling with it as much as anyone else, but we've gone another layer and vaccinated the over 60s. And they're talking about tonight, Ayelet Shaked, Interior Minister, has actually suggested that it now be lowered to the 40 and over. So we'll see a lot more Israelis who will have the third jab, which so far, according to tests that have been released, actually does have an effect and does raise the immunity levels, or that's probably not the right word, but raises the levels to what they were at the beginning after some of these people received the second jab.
All right, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. For our viewers, please join us Friday for a webinar with Ali Al-Flaneh discussing Iran's crisis. What's next? Which options? Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a great day.